Good morning. Good morning. Thank you all for being here, despite the snow and rain and wind and everything else outside. You really had to want to be here today to be here, and we appreciate it. My name is Brian Winter. I'm the editor-in-chief of America's Quarterly Magazine and the Vice President of Policy for America's Society and Council of the Americas. Few people realized it at the time, but 2014 was a historic year for Latin America. On March 17th of that year, we saw a police raid of a money laundering operation out of a gas station in Brasilia. This simple event would turn into one of the biggest corruption scandals ever detected anywhere in the world, the car wash scandal. To date, the investigations and the prosecutions are still ongoing, and we've seen dozens of people jailed and billions of dollars worth of fines. The tentacles have since spread into Colombia, Argentina, Peru, Mexico, and beyond, and they still continue to this day. But this is not just a story of Lava Jato, of the car wash probe, because later in 2014, in November, we saw the eruption of the so-called Casablanca scandal, the White House scandal, in Mexico, the product of investigative journalism. This was a case that had immediate and enduring consequences for the popularity of President Enrique Peña Nieto, who later conceded that he had made a mistake. 2014 also saw the beginnings of several corruption scandals in Chile, including one involving the son of President Michelle Bachelet. He was accused of using his influence to get a large bank loan for his wife. And 2014 was also the year that the CICIG, a UN-affiliated organization in Guatemala, began gathering evidence for a case involving fraud at the customs agency. This amazing case produced concrete proof of wrongdoing all the way to the upper echelons of Guatemalan government. First, the vice president was jailed. Then Congress stripped the stripped the president of his immunity from prosecution as tens of thousands of demonstrators outside peacefully demanded justice. The president, who you see here, Otto Perez Molina, resigned and was then jailed the next day. Well, as they say in journalism, which is my profession, 3 is a trend. And there's way more than 3 countries at work here. So the question is, why did all these things happen more or less at the same time? Now, it doesn't seem, we don't know for sure, but those of us who follow this for a living, it seems that corruption in Latin America is no worse than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, or 50 years ago. Instead, experts and analysts and some of the people who are here today tend to focus on 4 main factors. One is democracy. At the dawn of the 1980s, only 3 Latin American countries were full democracies. And today, following the democratizing wave that came with the end of the Cold War, there are only 2 dictatorships left in the region, Cuba and Venezuela. This has allowed judicial institutions and investigative journalism to mature and become more independent. The group of prosecutors leading car wash is primarily in their 30s and 40s. Judge Sergio Moro, who's with us today, is only 45 years old. I just turned 40, so I like to think that 45 is young. But 45 is young. And his is a generation that grew up under democracy. Now, this is a story that has been repeated to varying degrees elsewhere in the region. And as we look at this wave of prosecutions, it's no coincidence that this is all happening 1 full generation after democracy returned to Latin America. The second factor behind all of these cases seems to be the rise of the middle class. Thanks to the commodities boom and smart fiscal policies in the 2000s, 50 million Latin Americans have come out of poverty and into the middle class since 2003, according to the World Bank. And as people move into the middle class, their values change and their interests change. If you look, for example, at the case of Brazil, back in 2003, the primary concerns were unemployment, violence, and hunger. But if you look at 2016, corruption suddenly appears on the radar, as the #1 concern. This is because people's day-to-day needs were being met more frequently. Many of them were paying taxes when they weren't paying taxes before, and so they became more concerned about where their money was going. These values change. And lest anyone think that this is a Brazilian phenomenon, let me talk to you about another poll. If you look at the region as a whole, corruption now appears third on the agenda in Latin America, behind only the economy and crime. That's according to the Latino Barometro, which does a very respected, large annual survey. The percentage of Latin Americans who see corruption as their country's most pressing problem has nearly tripled since 2010, according to, again, Latino Barometro. Corruption is seen as the #1 issue, not just in Brazil, but in Colombia, and it's #2 in Peru and Mexico. The third reason for this change, for all this wave of cases, is the rise of social media, which has allowed news of corruption to travel more quickly and for protesters to organize themselves. This was the case with CICIG, with the Casablanca scandal in Mexico as well. Before, perhaps, government officials and business elites, to some extent, were able to play down or suppress news of corruption, no longer. And then finally, there have been technological and new legal changes as well. Of course, what's happening with corruption in Latin America, it's not just happening in the region. In just the last month, the president of South Africa, Jacob Zuma, resigned under a wave of corruption accusations, and police also said they would recommend charges against Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. There have also been changes such as banking secrecy laws that changed after the 2007-2008 financial crisis. Developments like the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act have also been key. But look, if you look at this in a global context, Latin America is really the most dramatic front in this global battle against corruption. We at America's Quarterly have been writing about this since early 2016 when we put together this cover, which got a lot of attention at the time, and we're very proud that we have all three of those people on the cover together for the first time today. The bottom line is that this, like so much else that's been happening in Latin America over the last 25 years, is a story of progress. This anti-corruption wave is the product of positive changes in the region and in the world, and the potential benefits are huge. There have been vast differences in the degree of success. Some countries have lagged behind. But everywhere there are signs of hope, and there are signs that change is already occurring. Latin America is the world's most unequal region. And if corruption substantially declines, inequality will decline also. There will be more resources for education, for health care, and for infrastructure. There will be a more level playing field for companies, local and foreign. This emphasis on corruption also has the potential to remake the region's political landscape. 2 out of 3 Latin Americans will elect a new president in 2018. And right now, candidates that have made corruption their #1 rallying cry are first in the polls in Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico. So as we stand here at the beginning of 2018, many of us are convinced that this is more than just a trend. This is more than just a moment. This is a movement. It's an anti-corruption movement in Latin America. It's one of those moments where social values change, where practices that were acceptable before no longer are. Similar, perhaps, in some ways to the civil rights movement, or Me Too, or the move against the robber barons in this country a century ago. It's a movement that has the potential to forever change the calculus of actors in both the private and public sector, and to transform the region for the better. But, and here's the question we want to ask today. What if we're wrong? What if this is just a passing phase? What if politicians and other defenders of the status quo succeed in rolling back the changes that have made Car Wash, La Linea, and other investigations possible? What if Latin Americans were actually more angry about the down economy in recent years, and that once economies pick back up, as they're generally expected to in 2018, the anger over corruption fades? What if the anti-corruption movement collapses under accusations of political bias, selective justice, and lack of due process? It's happened before. After all, Alberto Fujimori ran in 1989 as an anti-corruption, anti-establishment candidate. So did Fernando Collor. Both, of course, would resign after scandals of their own. And the most famous case is Mani Pulite. This, of course, was the case that back in Italy in the early 90s purged hundreds of people from the political system. And yet, nearly 30 years, the perception in Italy, nearly 30 years later, the perception in Italy is that very little actually changed. So what if this whole thing just ends up like Mani Pulite? Well, that's what we're going to debate today. How to ensure that the progress of recent years is consolidated and expanded even further. What reforms are necessary in order to make judges and prosecutors more effective? What changes does the private sector need to make? Have there been excesses? What changes do actors in the judicial sector need to make to avoid selective justice or the perception thereof? And is there a way to pursue corruption cases while also avoiding unnecessary damage for the economy? We have 10 extraordinary speakers who are here today to help us answer some of those questions. There have been other conferences similar to this one, but we think we have 2 points that are setting us apart today. One is that we're truly regional, and 2 is that we have substantial presence of the private sector here in the room today. So thank you all for being here. We're not here today to put anyone on a pedestal. And I have warned our speakers that we will ask them tough questions, both from the moderators and from the audience. I've also asked them to be frank and direct. There will be no taboos. A few programming notes before we start. You'll hear 3 languages today: English, Spanish, and Portuguese. So if you don't have all 3, please make sure that you have the little apparatuses that are either outside, and we can pass some around if you didn't grab them on your way in. Another note. We managed to bring together from all corners of the region a fabulous group. We're very proud of them. But some of you may have noticed there is a gender imbalance. We tried to do better, we weren't able to, and we regret that. Lots of people made this event possible today. My team, Alana Tumino, Leani Garcia, thank you for all your hard work. Susan Siegel, wherever you are, thank you for believing this initiative. Hi, Susan. Thank you for believing in this from the very beginning. And I'd also like to extend my heartfelt thanks to the Ford Foundation, the International Institute of Education, and the Open Society Foundations for making all of this possible. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Judge Sergio Moro to join me here on the stage. Thank you. That one over there. I want to ask you about Mani Pulite, because you have studied that going back years, and I want to ask you about some of those possible parallels that I just drew. But before I do, I want to ask, basically, how did we get here? And this extraordinary process that started almost exactly 4 years ago. If you think back, what was the one change that made the car wash case possible? Was it the Constitution of 1988? Was it plea bargain laws? What was it that suddenly created this climate, or was it so sudden, where a case like that was possible?
Well, first, good morning for everybody. I'm grateful to be here and to receive this invitation. I don't have an answer about your question. I think there is no such one thing that was the cause of this investigation or this movement. I think, Brazil got his new constitution on 1988, redemocratization. And in time, I think the institution become stronger, and also we have a more demanding democracy. And I think all that happened, it was a kind of a mixed result of a demanding more democracy, stronger institutions, a wish for a stronger democracy, a stronger economy. There is no one main reason, I think.
Let's talk about Manipulite. You've studied that case in detail. Can you explain to us why, this idea that what's happening right now will not end just like that did?
I have the great honor and pleasure to meet last year some of the prosecutors and judges who worked, and I was very happy because they are all a little bit old but alive. that is the first point. But well, the history is open. We cannot be sure about what will happen in our countries in the next years. I think Manipulite gave us an important lesson to overcome widespread corruption. It's absolutely necessary that you break impunity. The judicial system must work so that ones who are guilty of bribery or money laundering, they need an answer from our institutions, and the answer usually for this kind of serious crimes is prison. But however, the judicial process, maybe it's not enough to overcome widespread corruption. You need more general reforms from the government. And when you have government not so friendly, things tend to be more difficult. But it's hard to say, hard to know what would be Italy today without Manipulite. Maybe it would be worse. Mm-hmm. You cannot take out of history Manipulite. So in certain ways, it is some of the expectations that they have at that time. This expectation did not realize entirely, but I really believe that Italy is much better now because, let me put in a different way, I think Italy would be even worse now without Manipulite in the past.
You talked a little bit about the resistance that the Italian establishment was able to mount over time. And it's hard to avoid the perception right now that we're seeing a similar reaction in Brazil. I often feel like if this was the Star Wars trilogy, we'd be right in the middle of The Empire Strikes Back right now. Yeah. And I'm not the only, one of the Supreme Court justices, Barroso, has talked about a pact of the oligarchy to try to resist. Do you see signs of that? Are you worried about it?
We always have risks of setbacks. We are talking about power, about politics, and people struggle for power, and there are people who don't want to change. They want to remain in power, they want their privilege, even if this privilege means that you don't have rule of law and you have impunity for these crimes. So there will be always a risk of setbacks. What we need to do is try to avoid these setbacks. We have to continue to do our work. And I think as citizens, we could never give up. Okay, we are trying to build a better country, a better place to us and for our children. And I think this demands a stronger rule of law and democracy without impunity as a rule for this kind of crime. In Brazil, maybe we could say so far so good. Despite of signs of setback, I don't think that until now the ones who are against this break of impunity were able to do anything much too significant about this. Of course, there have been some setbacks, but I think we still have the tools to go ahead. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe in next year, next month, we will suffer major setbacks. The future is open, but as I said, we will never give up as judges, prosecutors, police officers, citizens, people who really believe in democracy.
So today and in other public forums, you cannot talk about current cases that you're seeing. So I'm not going to ask you about certain politicians. But when you look at the car wash operation as a whole, are we close to the end? I mean, you've talked about this before. You said last year that you thought that the investigative phase of the case would mostly wind down by the end of 2017. But here we are, 2018, actions continue, not just against specific politicians. And there are also sealed indictments of some executives that may continue to play out over time. So, I mean, can we expect, is this phase of the case at least close to ending, or do you keep finding new stuff?
It depends on you think about Lava Jato operation. Its core is about bribes in Petrobras contracts. Okay. Thinking about its core, I think the most part of the work has been done, at least in my court. And an important part of this case is in the hands of the Supreme Court, who has original jurisdiction over criminal charges against some high politicians who...
Just to explain to sort of non-Brazilians in the audience, people who are in elected office tend to have this special privilege, foro privilegiado, which means that the Supreme Court is the only body that can try them for crimes.
Exactly. And if you think in this part of the case, there still must to be done, because there are some criminal charges. I don't know exactly the number, but they have not been tried yet in the Supreme Court, and probably there are investigations going on the Supreme Court. And in my part of the case, I think the most part, the people without this stand privilege, briber payers, professional money launderings, and politicians who lost their mandate during the case. And of course, executives of Petrobras, I think the most part of them have been already tried. Of course, I have some other case. But if you think in general terms about this break of the rule of impunity, nowadays you have a lot of important cases in other courts. Rio de Janeiro, you have also in Brasilia. Some of these cases are part of Lava Jato in its origin. Some parts of this case are really new cases. So maybe you have now a lot of criminal cases being persecuted and tried in other courts with this new spirit, okay, that you have to break impunity, of course, using due process of law. But I'll not call all these cases Lava Jato cases.
Okay.
So if you're thinking in the general picture, of course, corruption will continue. It will appear new cases, and the courts will have work for the rest of its times.
Well, so on that note, let me ask you a question that I received from a friend from the private sector who's in attendance here today. And this is one person's question, but it's a question that I hear all the time. And people usually ask me first, they say, we're off the record, right? Okay? But let me read this, because I think it's well phrased, and again, I know it's a common question. Is there such a thing as enough is enough? It has been great that this corruption scandal has been unearthed and a lot of prominent people are going to jail. I believe that the rules of the game for campaign finance as well as for bidding on government contracts has changed. But we need to allow the economy to recover. Is there such an equation where one decides to prosecute what we know, state that any future infractions will be dealt with the utmost severity, but let's move forward in order to allow the economy to recover?
I don't think the investigations have into a bad impact in Brazil economy. I think the reasons were different. There are different reasons for the losses of the economy in the last years. And I think in medium and long term, these anti-corruption efforts, they only improve the efficiency of our economy. And it's no good to, you cannot solve this problem turning a blind eye. Maybe we could have an example here, a long example from the past. You have this great case called Watergate. And I heard that during the investigation and during the work of especially the Washington Post, some people complained that isn't it enough? Well, should we not forget Watergate and leave the politics free to do their work? But it gone to the end, and I think it make a better country, a better environment for the rule of law here in the United States. And as a judge, I don't have this discretionary power to, wow, let's take this, let's put this in the under the hug, and let's move on. I think that in time, this is bad, a very bad idea. If you have to deal with these problems in the past, so you could go on.
No, it's true that it's not necessarily the role of the judicial sector to worry about these questions. But you've also spoken about the role of public opinion and how important the support of Brazilians has been to the work that you've done, because it is essentially, it's kept the political world from interfering as much as it otherwise might have. But here we are, 4 years into the probe, and there are some signs of trouble on the front of political opinion. Democracy in Brazil is less popular, if you ask people in polls, than it has been in a generation. Only 25% of Brazilians told this Latino Barometro poll that they were satisfied with the state of their democracy. That's the lowest in all of Latin America. And I'm in Brazil a lot, and you sense that it's because people have grown frustrated with corruption. Certainly the economy plays a role, but they don't see any progress. They don't, after 4 years of these changes, and they were glad to see certain people go to jail, but they don't see yet that change. Does that worry you at all? And if so, if that isn't the role of the judicial sector to advance things, whose job is it?
I think it's the job for everyone, not only from judges, prosecutors, or regular citizens of this organized civil society, but of our, especially from our government or our leadership in government. And I understand people sometimes are frustrated, but these changes, there's no magic condoms to resolve the problems of democracy. People, in truth, I think they are not unsatisfied with democracy. They are unsatisfied with the problems of democracy. And it's work of everyone to fix these problems. And one of these major problems is widespread corruption and impunity. So people start to lose confidence in the rule of law. In time, they start to lose confidence in all the politicians and the judges, the prosecutors, and they start to lose confidence in democracy itself. So what is the answer for this insatisfaction is to make democracy stronger. And this demands that we need to break this rule of impunity and keep going with our work and demand that our leadership, our government, act with integrity.
One issue that you hear a lot in Brazil, especially lately, is this notion of selective justice, is this notion that the car wash probe has targeted some people and not others. And I know that's the perception of the people outside today who were, exercising their democratic right to protest and make their voices heard. What's your response to that? I mean, why, again, it's not as if only people from the Workers' Party have gone to jail because of car wash. I mean, it's been multiple parties, but this perception is still there that one ideological group has been more punished than the others. How do you respond to that?
Well, returning to Manipulite, they used the word at that time against the prosecutors and the judges, toga rosa, red judges, because they work in several cases, and the most heavy cases were against politicians from the center right or the right, but that was because they were in the government at that time, and they also had cases against the Communist Party then, but less cases. And in my opinion, it occurs in Brazil the same thing. The most part of, for example, in Petrobras cases, the investigation revealed that part of the money went to the Petrobras executives and part of the money to the ruling parties who were responsible to sustain that executives in their positions. So it's a kind of natural consequence that the most part of the case are against politicians from the ruling parties at that time. But if you see the records, the judicial records, you will find politicians from the left and politicians from the right. For example, one famous politician who some people consider an enemy of the Workers' Party is in jail, is serving prison time.
Who are we talking about?
The former Speaker of the House. I don't like to say names here, but it's a case that are already tried. And about the protesters, sometimes people have some illusions. Sorry, sometimes there are party affiliates. Sometimes people have some illusions about some idols. And sometimes it gets time to people realize the truth. But if you go to the judicial records, you see that nobody is being prosecuted or tried because of his political opinion, but because of bribes, because of money laundering, because of specific criminal conduct.
It's also true, perhaps, that some of the politicians in the center and center-right who have at least been mentioned in testimony have that protection because of this foro privilegiado, and they may face justice soon. They just haven't faced it with the same speed as people who no longer have that protection.
Some people say in Brazil about criminalization of politics, but well, really? Who is doing this is the part, or you cannot make a general statement, but who is doing this is some politicians. They are committing crimes, so they are doing this criminalization of politics, and the courts only react. There is no problem in general between judges and politicians. The problem is that some politicians committed crimes and they have to suffer the consequence because it's the rule of law. I agree with you. I think this is stand privilege, and that's not only me saying. Some of the justice of the Supreme Court, Brazilian Supreme Court, also say that this stand privilege works against accountability. So I think we should change this. Maybe we should.
You would like to see the end of foro privilegiado?
I think it would be a wise idea, maybe, if necessary, keeping it for the president, but I'm not really sure about this. I think in the extension that we have this stand privilege today, it works against...
It's like hundreds of people.
Yes, hundreds of people, all congressmen and all secretaries of the government.
Just one comment on the ideological aspect of this. I was interested in the comment that Dr. Ugas made when we spoke in the days leading up to the conference. I'd forgotten this, that the anti-corruption movement is seen in Peru as the language of the left, right? Because so many of the people who have been prosecuted there are either center or center right or right. So it's, to your point, maybe it's not ideological, it's just the people who are in power.
I think that's very... It's necessary to say that corruption is not a politician from the left or from the right. Corruption is the opposite of politics, I think. It's just criminal behavior.
So we have time for two questions, and I'd like to ask, we'll just ask them back to back, and then we'll give Judge Moro an opportunity to respond. So if you'd like to ask Judge Sergio Moro a question, please raise your hand.
Well, I thank you for coming and thank you for being here.
Would you identify yourself, please?
I'm Dan Newcomb. I'm a lawyer at Sherman & Sterling.
Thank you.
And one of the things that your prosecution has done is coordinate with the United States, coordinate with other countries, but at the same time, the prosecutions across Latin America have spread well beyond the countries you coordinated with. What is the role of the judiciary in coordinating the unintended consequences of the prosecution?
Is there a second question? There is not. Wow, shy group. We'll have to fix that. Yeah, Michelle.
Sorry.
It's okay. Can we have a microphone?
Reserve them for the guests, but
We'll just wait for the microphone, please. Sorry. Thank you.
Michelle Caruso Cabrera from CNBC here in the United States. Attorneys that we've spoken from in Brazil who represent some of the people that you've prosecuted have complained that some of your methodologies may not be legal. And one of the big complaints was, for example, promising that the statements that they made would be kept silent and then, or secret, and then suddenly the deposition and the verbatim of the deposition is leaked within hours to the press. Does your office do that? And is that by design?
Do you want to start with the first one?
About the first one, during the investigation, it was discovered that some of the Brazilian companies who paid bribes in Petrobras contract, also paid bribes abroad. Okay. And the Brazilian policy on this, I think, is to share the evidence to those who request the evidence. Maybe in some case we have to establish a condition because a big part of this evidence we get from plea agreements. And so there are some conditions to protect the people who gave the evidence. But as far as these conditions are accepted, we are ready to share the evidence with the other countries in their region. And that's all that we can do, because we could not do anymore. It will be necessary in each country to do its own efforts against corruption. I am very impressed, for example, by the work that is being made in Peru. I think they already have a lot of important cases in Peru against politicians who take bribes. But it's important to say also that it's necessary to have a large picture, because Brazilian companies probably are not the only villains in this story. Probably these people who took bribes from them probably took bribes from other foreign companies, and maybe from companies of their own country, because of environment favorable for bribery. So it's important not to vilify too much the Brazilian companies. They're not the only ones who pay bribes in the world.
And then the question about your methods and the leaks.
Well, let me explain something. Sometimes there is some confusion between leaks and public trials. Okay, it's in Brazil, our constitution demands that we cannot have secret procedures or secret trials. So in this case, this is Lava Jato operation. We understand that once a criminal charge is presented, everything should go public. Okay. During the investigation, sometimes it's necessary to have secrets to be efficient investigation. But after the investigation gets to an end, again, it's necessary to make all available to the public. There could be during the investigation maybe some one or two or maybe some leaks, but I can assure you that I'm not responsible for anyone. And it's very difficult to do an investigation about leaks. Returning to the Watergate case here, wow, how long does it take to discover who was the one responsible?
Deep throat.
Yes. Well, if you look to the whole case, the widespread corruption, all the problems with impunity, I think it's wrong to have this attention on the leaks. Wow. The problems were the leaks on this case, or the criminal behavior of all these people. But again, I'm against leaks. As a judge, I have to obey strictly the law, but I don't see the leaks on this case as a major problem.
You will be around for our second panel this morning, but this is the conclusion of this interview, and thank you so much for being here. A round of applause for Judge Moro. Thank you.